Jake Morrison stared at the job posting on his cracked laptop screen for the 15th time, wondering if desperation had finally made him illiterate. Specialized cultivation work. Agricultural experience preferred but not required. Exceptional compensation for the right candidate. Remote location, housing provided. The salary figure at the bottom made his coffee-stained engineering degree feel like expensive toilet paper. His landlord's voice echoed from yesterday's phone call. 3 months, Jake. That's how behind you are. The eviction notice crumpled in his trash can serve as a paper monument to his spectacular career implosion. 6 months ago, he'd been designing irrigation systems for vertical farms. Now he was contemplating manual labor that paid more than his engineering job ever had. The application process was refreshingly simple, almost suspiciously so. No request for references, no background checks that might reveal his recent employment gap. Just basic information and a peculiar questionnaire about openness to new experiences and comfort with unconventional working relationships. Jake checked every box marked highly adaptable and hit submit before his common sense could intervene. The response came within hours. A professional email from Dr. Elena Vasquez invited him to Verdant Horizons Research Facility in Oregon. The attached travel voucher covered first-class rail tickets and more expense money than Jake had seen in months. He packed his few remaining possessions, locked his empty apartment, and tried to ignore the voice in his head asking why a farming operation needed a research facility. The train carried him through increasingly wild terrain, civilization gradually surrendering to dense forests and mountain peaks that scraped the clouds. Jake dozed fitfully, dreaming of spreadsheets that morphed into root systems and equations that grew leaves. When he finally arrived at the tiny mountain station, a sleek electric vehicle waited with his name displayed on a holographic sign that flickered slightly in the afternoon light. The driver, a cheerful man named Pete, chatted about weather patterns and soil composition during the winding drive-up increasingly narrow mountain roads. Been working up there long? Jake asked, noting how Pete's hands moved confidently over controls that seemed more advanced than typical farm equipment. 3 years now, Pete replied, navigating a hairpin turn with practiced ease. Best job I've ever had, though it takes some getting used to. The work's different than what most folks expect. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. But the people are good, and the compensation more than makes up for the adjustment period. Jake was about to ask what needed adjusting when Verdant Horizons came into view. The facility sprawled across a mountain plateau, its glass structures reflecting the setting sun like scattered mirrors. Solar arrays and wind turbines dotted the surrounding landscape, but Jake's engineering eye caught details that seemed oddly advanced. The solar panels shimmered with an almost liquid quality, and the wind turbines rotated with an eerie silence that defied physics. Impressive setup, Jake observed, noting energy readings on the vehicle's dashboard that shouldn't have been possible with conventional renewable systems. Wait until you see the inside, Pete chuckled. Doctor, Vasquez will give you the full tour tomorrow. Tonight, we'll get you settled in the dormitories. The worker housing surprised Jake with its quality. Instead of the cramped barracks he'd expected, he found a comfortable apartment with modern furnishings and a kitchenette stocked with food that actually looked edible. His neighbors introduced themselves over dinner in the communal dining hall, a mix of agricultural workers, technicians, and researchers who shared an oddly conspiratorial air. New guy, huh? Asked Maria, a woman whose calloused hands suggested genuine farm experience. What's your background? Engineering, actually. Irrigation and agricultural systems. Jake felt slightly embarrassed admitting his professional credentials to people doing manual labor. Engineering. Mark, a bearded man in his 40s, raised an eyebrow. That's useful. The systems here are unique. You'll see what I mean. Their conversation was interrupted by what sounded like a low harmonic hum resonating through the building structure. The other workers barely seemed to notice, continuing their meals as if building singing was perfectly normal. Generator maintenance, Maria explained casually, though Jake's trained ear detected frequencies no conventional generator produced. Happens every evening around this time. Jake spent his first night listening to the facility's unusual acoustic symphony, humming that seemed to pulse with organic rhythms, occasional chimes that reminded him of wind through metal, and underlying vibrations that made his teeth ache pleasantly. Through his window, he watched figures moving between the greenhouse structures, their silhouettes oddly graceful in the moonlight. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of plants that glowed with their own light and equations that solved themselves while he watched. He woke feeling strangely refreshed, as if the mountain air carried more oxygen than physically possible. Dr. Vasquez met him at breakfast, a middle-aged woman whose professional demeanor couldn't quite hide an amused twinkle in her eyes. "Mr. Morrison, welcome to Verdant Horizons. I trust your first night was comfortable." "Very, thank you, though I have to ask, what exactly is that humming sound?" "Resonance from our cultivation systems," she replied smoothly. "We use some unconventional methods here. Frequency modulation, bioelectric enhancement, that sort of thing. Your engineering background should help you understand the technical aspects." She led him on a tour that challenged every assumption Jake had about modern agriculture. The greenhouse complexes contained plants he didn't recognize, growing in substrate that looked more like crystalline matrices than soil. The irrigation systems incorporated what appeared to be fiber optic networks, carrying not just water but streams of light that pulsed with living rhythms. "Impressive photonic integration," Jake observed, studying a control panel covered in symbols he couldn't read. "Though I'm not familiar with this interface design." Dr. Vasquez's smile grew mysterious. "We collaborate with some very innovative partners, international specialists with unique perspectives on cultivation techniques." They paused at an observation deck overlooking the facility's central complex, where Jake noticed workers tending plants alongside figures whose movements seemed too fluid, too graceful for ordinary humans. The distance made details impossible to discern, but something about their silhouettes triggered an uncomfortable sensation of recognition without memory. "Your colleagues seem very dedicated," Jake commented. "They are. This work requires special commitment, Mr. Morrison. The relationships we cultivate here go deeper than typical employer-employee arrangements. We're growing something entirely new, a form of agriculture that could revolutionize how humanity approaches food production and environmental sustainability." Jake nodded, though her metaphors felt loaded with meanings he couldn't grasp. "And my role? Tomorrow, you'll meet your cultivation partner and begin the orientation process. I think you'll find the work fulfilling in ways you don't expect." That evening, Jake sat in his apartment reviewing technical manuals that seemed to describe farming equipment designed by aliens. The diagrams showed familiar concepts: nutrient distribution, growth optimization, environmental control, but implemented through technologies that belonged in science fiction. He was beginning to understand why the pay was so generous. As darkness fell and the facility's harmonic humming began its nightly symphony, Jake wondered what exactly he'd signed up for. Outside his window, those graceful figures moved through the moonlit gardens again, and this time he could swear he glimpsed something that made his breath catch, ears that tapered to elegant points, catching starlight like sculptured silver. Whatever tomorrow brought, Jake Morrison was fairly certain it wouldn't involve conventional farming. Jake woke to the sound of his apartment door chiming with a melodic sequence that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his chest. He stumbled to answer it, finding Dr. Vasquez waiting with 2 steaming cups of coffee and what looked like a briefcase made from living wood. "Orientation day," she announced cheerfully, handing him a cup. "I brought the good stuff, actual Ethiopian beans, not the synthetic protein coffee most facilities serve." Jake sipped gratefully, noting the coffee tasted better than anything he'd had in months. Is this another unconventional cultivation technique? In a way, we believe proper nutrition affects receptivity to new experiences. Speaking of which, are you ready to meet your cultivation partner? The phrase carried weight that made Jake's stomach flutter with anticipation and mild terror. Define cultivation partner. Dr. Vasquez's smile grew enigmatic. Someone who will help you understand what we're really growing here. Fair warning, she has a sense of humor that takes some getting used to. They walked through corridors lined with panels that seemed to pulse with soft bioluminescence, past laboratories where technicians monitored equipment that hummed with the same harmonic frequencies Jake had heard the night before. Through observation windows, he glimpsed cultivation chambers filled with plants that definitely weren't in any agricultural textbook. Dr. Vasquez, exactly what kind of crops are we cultivating here? The most important crop of all, Mr. Morrison, understanding. Jake was formulating a response to that cryptic non-answer when they entered a reception area that looked more like a living room than a corporate space. Organic curves replaced harsh angles, and the furniture seemed grown rather than manufactured. Sitting in what might charitably be called a chair was a woman who made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She appeared entirely human, except for ears that swept upward in elegant points, framing a face that combined classical beauty with an otherworldly quality that made Jake forget how to form sentences. When she looked up from the tablet she'd been studying, her eyes held depths that suggested experiences beyond anything Earth could offer. "Jake Morrison, meet Lyra," Dr. Vasquez announced. "Lyra, this is our new agricultural specialist." Lyra stood with fluid grace, extending a hand that felt surprisingly warm and entirely human. Agricultural specialist. Is that what they're calling it now? Her voice carried an accent Jake couldn't place, musical in a way that made ordinary conversation sound like poetry. "I was told you were an engineer who got desperate enough to consider manual labor." Jake felt his face redden. "Well, when you put it like that. Oh, I like honesty. It's refreshing after dealing with humans who think they need to impress me." Lyra's grin revealed teeth that were perfectly normal except for canines just slightly too sharp. "Though I should mention, the work here isn't exactly what your employment contract described." "I'm beginning to gather that. The plants outside look like they belong in a botany textbook from another planet." "That's because they do." Lyra gestured for him to sit, her movements carrying an otherworldly grace that made Jake feel clumsy just watching. "We should probably start with the basics. I'm not from around here." Jake glanced at Dr. Vasquez, who nodded encouragingly. "Define around here." "Well, this solar system, for starters. My people call our homeworld Ethros, though by now there's not much world left to speak of." Lyra's expression grew momentarily sad before brightening again. "But let's not dwell on cosmic real estate problems. The important thing is that we need humans like you to help us survive on Earth." "Survive how exactly?" Lyra stood and walked to a wall panel that responded to her touch by displaying what looked like a molecular diagram crossed with a musical score. "My people evolved in symbiosis with our environment. We generate bioelectric fields that promote plant growth, but we also require compatible energy signatures from other sentient beings to maintain our own biological processes." Jake studied the display, his engineering mind trying to process concepts that seemed to blend science with magic. "So you're saying you need humans for what? Energy?" "Energy, companionship, genetic diversity, terrible jokes about Earth customs. It's a comprehensive package deal." Lyra's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Though I should warn you, the bonding process involves sharing more than just bioelectric fields. You'll experience fragments of my memories, and I'll gain access to yours. It's like the ultimate workplace team-building exercise, except with interdimensional consequences." That seems like something that should have been in the job description. "Would you have applied if it had been?" Jake considered this. Probably not. Exactly. Which is why we start. Jake's first bonding session began with what Lyra cheerfully called consciousness calibration, which sounded far more pleasant than it felt. They sat facing each other in a chamber that hummed with the same harmonic frequencies he'd been hearing since his arrival, while monitoring equipment that belonged in a space opera tracked their bioelectric output. Think of it like tuning a radio, Lyra explained, her hands resting palm up on her knees. Except the radio waves are our thoughts, and if we tune incorrectly, you might accidentally experience my memories of last Tuesday's lunch instead of the profound cosmic insights we're aiming for. What did you have for lunch last Tuesday? Synthesized kelp protein with mineral supplements. Trust me, you don't want those memories. Jake closed his eyes as Lyra had instructed, trying to find the meditative state she described. Instead, his mind filled with the usual chaos of human consciousness, grocery lists, random song lyrics, and persistent worry about his overdue credit card payments. You're thinking very loudly, Lyra observed. I can hear something about automotive insurance and whether you remembered to lock your apartment door. Sorry, meditation isn't exactly my strong suit. That's what makes this interesting. Ethani consciousness tends toward what you might call organized harmonies. Human minds are more like jazz improvisation, chaotic but surprisingly creative. Lyra's voice took on a distant quality. Try focusing on a single memory, something peaceful. Jake thought of his grandmother's garden, the way sunlight filtered through tomato leaves on summer afternoons. The memory felt warm and golden, tinged with the smell of rich earth and growing things. That's beautiful, Lyra murmured, and Jake realized he could sense her presence at the edge of his thoughts, gentle and curious. May I share something similar? Before he could respond, Jake's awareness expanded beyond the boundaries of his own skull. He found himself standing in a crystalline garden, where plants grew in impossible geometric patterns, their leaves catching light that shifted through spectrums beyond human vision. The air itself seemed to sing, and he understood somehow that every growing thing contributed to a vast harmonic symphony. This is how gardens felt on Ethros, Lyra's mental voice explained. Every plant connected to every other, all of them connected to us. The beauty of it overwhelmed Jake, and tears he didn't remember shedding tracked down his cheeks. When the shared memory faded, he found Lyra watching him with compassionate understanding. That's the usual human reaction, she said gently. Your species experiences beauty very intensely, but usually in isolation. We experience it as part of a greater whole. It's gone, Jake whispered, feeling the loss like a physical ache. Not gone, just not accessible yet without deeper bonding. Lyra stood and stretched, her movements flowing like water. But that's enough for your first session. Any more, and you might start speaking in harmonics for the rest of the day. They spent the afternoon working in the facility's cultivation chambers, where Jake learned that farming, with an Ethani partner, bore little resemblance to conventional agriculture. Lyra could coax growth from seeds with her touch, while Jake's role involved monitoring the bioelectric feedback systems and adjusting environmental controls that seemed to respond as much to intention as to programming. The plants here are hybrids, Lyra explained as they worked with specimens that looked like a botanist's fever dream. Ethani genetic material integrated with Earth species. They can survive in either world's environment, but they require both human and Ethani bioelectric signatures to reach full maturity. And they produce food. Among other things, the fruits contain nutrients optimized for both human and Ethani metabolism. The roots process atmospheric toxins more efficiently than anything either world evolved naturally. The leaves can be processed into materials stronger than steel but biodegradable. Lyra touched a flowering vine that immediately burst into blooms that glowed with their own soft light. Think of them as living technology. Jake watched the plants respond to their combined presence, growing visibly as they worked. This could solve world hunger. It could solve a lot of problems if both our species can learn to cooperate. Lyra's expression grew thoughtful, though there are complications we haven't discussed yet. What kind of complications? The kind that involve government officials who view alien refugees with suspicion, even when those refugees are trying to help solve humanity's agricultural and environmental crises. Lyra plucked one of the glowing fruits and handed it to Jake. Try this. Fair warning, it tastes like someone mixed strawberries with starlight. The fruit was indeed unlike anything Jake had ever tasted, sweet and complex with flavors that seemed to evolve as he chewed. More importantly, he felt energized in a way that went beyond simple nutrition, as if the fruit had somehow recharged his cellular batteries. Enhanced metabolic efficiency, Lyra noted, observing his reaction. One of those fruits contains enough nutrition to sustain a human for an entire day, with no negative health effects and improved cognitive function as a bonus. The implications are staggering, which is exactly what worries certain government agencies. They're less interested in the benefits and more concerned about dependence on alien technology. Lyra's voice carried an edge of worry. Dr. Vasquez has been fielding inquiries from officials who want to classify our presence as a potential security threat. Jake felt a protective surge that surprised him with its intensity. That's ridiculous. You're refugees, not invaders. Tell that to the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs. They've scheduled an inspection visit next week. Lyra managed a wry smile. I suppose we should be flattered they created an entire government department just for us. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Jake marveling at how natural the partnership felt despite its impossible nature. When Lyra accidentally brushed his hand while reaching for a tool, he felt an echo of her thoughts, amused appreciation for his clumsy human efficiency mixed with deeper currents of loneliness and hope. Sorry, Lyra pulled back quickly. Casual contact can trigger resonance effects. I should have warned you. It's fine, actually it was nice, feeling less alone for a moment. Lyra's pointed ears shifted slightly. A gesture Jake was learning indicated surprise. You felt alone, but humans are surrounded by other humans constantly. Being surrounded by people isn't the same as being understood by them. Jake hesitated, then decided honesty was probably important in a relationship involving psychic bonding. I've never felt truly connected to anyone. And now? Jake considered the question while studying the hybrid plants thriving under their combined influence. Now I'm beginning to understand what connection might actually feel like. Lyra's smile held warmth that seemed to radiate through the chamber. That's the real cultivation we're doing here, Jake. Not just plants, but understanding between species that might have more in common than either of us realized. That evening, Jake found himself in the communal dining hall surrounded by other human-Ethani partnerships. The conversation flowed between languages, with the Ethani occasionally communicating in harmonic sequences that bypassed spoken words entirely. Mark, the bearded man from Jake's first night, sat with his partner Zara, their synchronization so complete they seemed to anticipate each other's needs without conscious thought. How long have you two been bonded? Jake asked during a lull in the multilingual chatter. 8 months, Mark replied. Started as a temporary arrangement, but we discovered we work better together than either of us managed alone. The humans call it symbiosis, Zara added, her voice carrying the same musical quality as Lyra's. We call it completing each other's incomplete songs. Poetic, Jake observed. Everything sounds poetic when you're telepathically linked to someone whose entire culture communicates through harmony, Mark laughed. Though I have to admit, human consciousness feels a lot less chaotic when it's balanced by Ethani mental structures. Jake glanced at Lyra, who was engaged in a rapid harmonic exchange with another Ethani. What are they discussing? Probably comparing notes on human psychology, Mark grinned. Fair warning, they find us endlessly fascinating in the same way we might study exotic insects. Exotic insects with useful bioelectric signatures, Zara corrected with amusement. Though Jake's resonance patterns are particularly interesting. Lyra mentioned he has unusual compatibility markers. Unusual how? Most humans require weeks of gradual adjustment to handle even basic memory sharing. You managed a full sensory overlay on your first attempt without psychological discomfort. Zara studied Jake with curiosity. Either you're remarkably adaptable, or you're naturally suited for consciousness expansion. But Jake wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or a warning. Is that good or bad? It means the bonding process will proceed faster than normal, Mark explained. But it also means you'll experience more profound changes. Some humans find that overwhelming. Others find it addictive, Zara added quietly. The sensation of expanded consciousness, of being part of something larger than individual human awareness. A few partners have chosen permanent integration, rather than returning to purely human existence. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What does permanent integration mean, exactly? A complete merger of consciousness, Lyra said, rejoining their conversation. Two minds becoming one hybrid entity that retains the best aspects of both human and Ethani psychology. But you lose your individual identity. You transform it into something new. The humans who have chosen integration describe it as evolution rather than loss. Lyra's expression grew serious. Though it's irreversible, which is why we discuss it extensively before anyone makes that choice. Jake stared at his dinner, trying to process the implications while hybrid fruits that tasted like concentrated sunshine dissolved on his tongue. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been paying rent. Now he was contemplating voluntary consciousness merger with an alien refugee whose very presence made him question everything he'd assumed about human existence. No pressure, Lyra added with gentle humor. We're still working up to basic bioelectric synchronization. Consciousness merger is more of a long-term relationship milestone. Like meeting the parents. More like becoming them, Mark muttered, earning a harmonic laugh from Zara. Jake couldn't help grinning despite his existential vertigo. Whatever he'd signed up for, it was definitely more interesting than unemployment. The Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs arrived on a Tuesday morning in 3 black vehicles that looked more suitable for transporting nuclear materials than conducting agricultural inspections. Jake watched from the greenhouse observation deck as men in identical suits emerged, their movements precise and humorless in a way that made him think of military automatons. They look friendly, Lyra observed dryly, her pointed ears twitching with what Jake had learned was the Ethani equivalent of nervous laughter. About as friendly as a tax audit, Jake replied, noting how the agents immediately began deploying scanning equipment that hummed with frequencies similar to the facility's own harmonics. Think they know what they're actually looking for? Probably not, which makes them more dangerous than if they did. Dr. Vasquez joined them at the observation window, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine worry. They're operating under the assumption that any alien presence represents a potential threat to national security. The lead agent, a stern woman whose credentials identified her as Director Sarah Walsh, wasted no time demanding access to all facility records, research data, and what she termed specimen containment areas. Jake had to suppress inappropriate laughter at the idea of Lyra and her companions being contained like laboratory cultures. We'll need to interview all human personnel individually, Director Walsh announced, her gaze sweeping the assembled staff with clinical detachment. Standard protocol for potential alien influence assessment. Alien influence assessment, Jake whispered to Lyra. Do they think you've brainwashed us? Well, technically speaking, we have been sharing consciousness and altering your neural chemistry through bioelectric resonance, Lyra pointed out helpfully. From their perspective, that probably does qualify as influence. You're not helping. I'm being accurate, there's a difference. Jake's interview took place in a sterile conference room, where Director Walsh and two subordinates questioned him with the enthusiasm of people investigating a particularly boring form of tax fraud. They wanted to know about his recruitment, his duties, his interactions with the extraterrestrial entities, and whether he'd experienced any unusual mental phenomena. Define unusual, Jake said, deciding honesty might be the best policy since they probably had equipment capable of detecting lies anyway. Telepathic contact, shared memories, altered perception of reality, compulsive behavior regarding the alien subjects. Jake considered his response carefully. I've experienced enhanced cognitive function, improved physical health, and what I describe as expanded empathy. If those qualify as unusual mental phenomena, then yes. Expanded empathy. Understanding other perspectives more clearly, feeling more connected to other people and to my environment. Jake met Director Walsh's skeptical stare evenly, basically the opposite of what you'd expect from harmful alien influence. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering everything from his financial situation before employment to his current relationship status. Jake answered truthfully while carefully avoiding details about consciousness merging or the true extent of his bonding with Lyra. One final question, Mr. Morrison. If ordered to cease all contact with the extraterrestrial entities, would you comply? Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Are you planning to issue such an order? Please answer the question. Jake thought about Lyra's laugh. The way shared memories had shown him beauty beyond human imagination, the profound sense of connection he'd never experienced with his own species. I'd want to understand the reasoning behind such an order before making any commitments. Director Walsh made notes that probably weren't complimentary. The agents spent 3 days examining every aspect of the facility, their presence creating an atmosphere of tense anxiety that affected both humans and Ethani. Jake watched Lyra grow increasingly withdrawn, her natural humor dimmed by the constant scrutiny. They're going to shut us down, she said quietly as they worked together in the cultivation chambers under the watchful eyes of 2 agents. I can feel it in their emotional resonance. Fear, suspicion, the need to control what they don't understand. There has to be something we can do. Like what? We're refugees, Jake. We have no legal standing, no political power, no leverage except the agricultural benefits we provide. Lyra touched a hybrid plant that immediately responded with accelerated growth. And apparently, those benefits aren't enough to outweigh their security concerns. That evening, Jake found himself in an emergency meeting with Dr. Vasquez and the other human partners. The mood was grim as they discussed contingency plans and legal options that seemed depressingly limited. The preliminary report classifies our work as potentially destabilizing to human genetic and psychological integrity, Dr. Vasquez announced. They're recommending immediate cessation of all human-Ethani interaction pending further study. Which means what exactly? Mark asked, his arm unconsciously moving to protect Zara, who sat beside him with the quiet dignity Jake had come to associate with her species. Deportation if they can figure out where to deport us to, Zara replied with bitter humor. Internment if they can't. They can't just imprison refugees who